The call came at 2000 and a morning. I know the exact time because I had just checked my phone before bed, setting my alarm for 6 a.m., thinking about the grant proposal I needed to finish by Friday. My life at that moment was completely ordinary. And then the phone rang. It was my mother. "The police are at your brother's house," she said. No hello. No, "Are you awake?" Just that. "They're asking about the deed to Grandma Ruth's property. You need to fix this. Tonight." I sat up in the dark and said, "What does that have to do with me?" She paused in a way that told me everything. That pause was the answer. Let me back up. My grandmother, Ruth Elaine Hargrove, passed away 14 months before that phone call. She was 81 years old, sharp until the very end. The kind of woman who remembered every birthday without writing it down and made cornbread from memory because she said recipes were for people who didn't trust themselves. She raised me for 3 years when my parents' marriage was falling apart, and those 3 years were the steadiest of my childhood. She was the person I called when things got hard. When she died, I sat in her kitchen for 2 hours before I could make myself leave. Her estate was modest but meaningful: a savings account, some jewelry, and the property. A half-acre lot in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, where she had lived for 40 years. The house on it wasn't worth much structurally, but the land had appreciated significantly because of a commercial development that had gone in nearby. An appraiser put the value somewhere between $190,000 and $220,000, depending on the buyer. Grandma Ruth's will was clear. The property was to be divided equally between her 2 grandchildren, who had lived with her, me and my brother, Derek. That was the will. What happened to the will is a different story. Derek is 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one my parents talked about at dinner: his grades, his baseball stats, his plans. I was quieter, more likely to be reading in my room than performing for company. My parents loved me, I believe that, but there was a temperature difference in the room whenever Derek walked in versus whenever I did. He ran warmer. I was always just slightly below the threshold that made people lean in. By the time we were adults, I had accepted that dynamic. I had a job I was proud of, friends I'd chosen carefully, a life that felt like mine. I didn't need to be the favorite. I had just stopped expecting anything different. What I had not expected was that Derek would use that dynamic as a weapon. 4 months after Grandma Ruth's funeral, I got a letter from an attorney I didn't recognize. It informed me that the property transfer had been completed and that as the sole heir listed on the deed, Derek Hargrove was now the legal owner of record. I read that letter 3 times. Sole heir. I called the attorney's office immediately. The receptionist told me the matter was closed. I called Derek. He didn't answer. I called my mother, and she said in a voice that was careful in a way that made my stomach drop, "It's complicated, honey. Derek handled all the paperwork after Grandma passed. You know how much he did for this family." I knew what she was doing. She was reminding me of my role. In our family, Derek was the one who showed up loudly at holidays, at crises, with opinions and plans, and a voice that filled the room. I was the one who showed up quietly. I handled things without announcing them. I drove Grandma Ruth to her chemotherapy appointments for 8 months without telling my parents how many there were. I organized her finances, paid her utility bills from my own account when her pension was delayed, and sat with her on the nights she couldn't sleep. I did not do any of this for credit. I did it because she was my grandmother and I loved her. But in the ledger my family kept, the visible one, the one that counted, Derek was present and I was background. My mother was now asking me to stay in the background. I did not say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "I'm going to need to see the paperwork." She said, "Let's not make this into something bigger than it is." I said, "Mom, he forged the deed." She said, "You don't know that." I did know that, because Grandma Ruth had shown me her will herself. 2 years before she died, she sat me down at her kitchen table, poured 2 cups of coffee, and walked me through it page by page. She told me she wanted me to know. She said, "I don't want there to be any confusion after I'm gone." She was meticulous. She had the will notarized by someone at her church and kept a copy in a lockbox with her insurance documents. I had seen that will with my own eyes. It named both of us. It split the property equally. Whatever Derek had filed with the county was not that document. What I did not tell my mother, what I did not tell anyone, was that I had a copy of the original will. Grandma Ruth had handed me one the day she showed it to me. She slid it across the table in a manila envelope and said, "Keep this somewhere safe." I had put it in a fireproof box in the back of my closet, where it had sat for 2 years without me thinking about it much. It wasn't a secret. It just wasn't relevant until it was. I also didn't mention that I had been documenting everything since the day I got the attorney's letter. Every phone call with my mother, I noted the date, time, and what was said. Every text from Derek asking me to let this go, and there were several, I screenshotted and emailed to myself. When a mutual family friend reached out to tell me that Derek was really stressed and that I should be the bigger person, I wrote down the conversation, word for word, within 10 minutes of hanging up. I didn't know exactly what I was building. I just knew that something was wrong, and that in my family, the person who didn't write things down was always the one who lost. The pressure started about 3 weeks after that first call from my mother. Derek called me on a Tuesday evening. He was using his calm voice, the one that meant he had already decided how the conversation was going to go and was just waiting for me to agree. He said Grandma Ruth had told him, separately, that she wanted him to have the property. He said she'd changed her mind about the will but hadn't updated the paperwork before she passed. He said that technically what he did was just correcting an oversight. I asked him what document he had filed with the county recorder's office. He said it was a deed transfer that Grandma Ruth had signed before she died. I asked when she had signed it. He said about 3 weeks before she passed. 3 weeks before she passed, Grandma Ruth was in the hospital. I know this because I was there. I had taken 2 days off work to stay with her because her oxygen levels had dropped and the doctors wanted to monitor her. She was on medication that made her confused and tired. She slept most of the day. On one of the afternoons I was there, she woke up, looked at me, and asked if her cat had been fed. She hadn't had a cat in 11 years. She did not sign any legal documents in that window. She was not in a condition to sign legal documents. And if she had, I would have known about it because I was there. What Derek was describing had not happened. I don't know if he truly believed his own version of events, or if he had simply told the story so many times that it had started to feel true. Either way, the document he had filed was not legitimate. I said, "Derek, I was with her those last weeks. I know what condition she was in." He said, "You're remembering it differently." There it was, the reframe. The version of events where my memory is the problem, my presence is debatable, my grief is just confusion. I said, "Okay." He said, "So we're good." I said, "I'll be in touch." What happened next is the part my family did not see coming because they had spent 30 years watching me absorb things quietly and assume that quiet meant acceptance. I hired an attorney. Her name was Patricia Okafor. She was methodical, unimpressed by emotional appeals, and had handled estate fraud cases before. When I brought her the manila envelope with the original will, the photographs I had taken of every document Grandma Ruth had shown me, the hospital records from those final weeks, and the text messages from Derek, she read through everything and then looked up at me and said, "This is a strong case." She filed a challenge to the deed transfer with the county. She subpoenaed the notary whose name appeared on Derek's filed document. What came back was important. The notary had no record of ever meeting with Ruth Elaine Hargrove. The signature on the deed, when compared to known samples of my grandmother's handwriting from that period, showed inconsistencies that a forensic documents examiner later characterized as significant. The date on the document placed the supposed signing during the exact window of my grandmother's hospitalization. My attorney also contacted the original attorney who had drawn up Grandma Ruth's actual will. That attorney had retained his own copy. It matched mine exactly. When Derek's attorney reached out to discuss a possible settlement, Patricia handed me the phone summary and asked, "What do you want out of this?" I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the kitchen table, the coffee, the manila envelope slid across to me. The way my grandmother had said, "I don't want any confusion after I'm gone." I said, "Full enforcement of the original will, exactly as written." The deposition happened on a Thursday in November. Derek showed up with his attorney and a version of events that had grown more elaborate since our phone call. He claimed my grandmother had expressed her wishes verbally to multiple people. His attorney produced a statement from a family friend who said she had heard Ruth mention wanting Derek to have the property. Patricia asked the friend under oath whether Ruth had ever said this in the presence of an attorney, a notary, or any official witness. She said no. Patricia then introduced the hospital records, the medication logs, the nursing staff notes from those final weeks. She introduced the forensic examiner's report on the signature. She introduced the subpoena response from the notary. Derek's attorney asked for a recess. When they came back, the settlement offer was on the table. I won't share the exact figure, but I will tell you that it reflected the full appraised value of my half of the property, plus legal fees, plus additional damages for the fraudulent filing. Derek sold the property to cover it, the house that my grandmother had lived in for 40 years. The one with the cornbread kitchen and the porch where she used to watch the sunset was sold to a developer within 6 months. That part is the one I sit with. The legal outcome was right. The process was right. My grandmother's wishes were honored, technically in the sense that I received what she intended me to have. But the house is gone now and I can't go back to it, and there is no version of justice that returns that. My mother called me the week after the settlement was finalized. She did not apologize exactly. What she said was, "I hope you feel like you got what you needed," which is a sentence designed to sound generous while placing all the wrongness on my side. I said, "Grandma Ruth was clear about what she wanted. I made sure it happened." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Derek is really struggling." I said, "I know." She said, "He may have to sell his car." I said, "Mom, he filed a fraudulent deed. He tried to take property that wasn't his by forging our grandmother's signature when she was in the hospital on oxygen. I didn't do this to him. He did this to himself." She didn't respond to that. She said she hoped we could all move forward as a family. I don't know what that means, honestly. I'm not sure I'm against it in principle, but I'd stopped contorting myself to make it easier for other people to avoid the truth of what happened. That is a different thing than being angry. I'm not angry most days. What I am is clear. I'm clear about what my grandmother wanted. I'm clear about what Derek did. I'm clear about what my parents chose when they were given the chance to choose. And I'm clear about the fact that for most of my life, I played a role in this family that was built on my willingness to absorb, accommodate, and disappear. And that role was never going to protect me when it actually mattered. The copy of the will is still in the fireproof box. I don't need it anymore, but I've kept it. Sometimes I take it out and look at my grandmother's name on the page, typed in clean black letters. Ruth Elaine Hargrove. She knew, I think, that she needed to hand me that envelope. She knew her family well enough to understand that the documented version of the truth and the family's version of the truth might not end up being the same thing. She gave me the tools. I just finally used them. There's a photograph of her on my desk, taken on her back porch, probably 15 years ago, squinting into the sun and laughing at something out of frame. She looks like a person who has decided not to waste time on things that aren't worth it. I try to look like that now. I'm not all the way there, but I'm working on it. If you're somewhere in the middle of a situation like this one, where the people who should protect the truth are instead protecting the person who broke it, I want you to hear this. Document everything. Keep the envelope. And when someone tells you to be the bigger person, ask yourself whether bigger means wiser and grounded, or whether it just means smaller and quieter in a way that only benefits them. My grandmother did not raise me to be quiet. She raised me to be careful. Those are not the same thing. I'm still learning the difference.